At 9:17 on the morning of March 4, 1944, 16 P-51 Mustangs crossed the German border. They flew high 28,000 feet above a continent at war engines humming steadily as thin white contrails stretched behind them like scars in the sky. From that altitude, Germany looked calm, peaceful, even. But every man in those cockpits knew better. Leading the formation was Colonel Donald Blakesley, a hard-driving commander who had been fighting since the earliest days of the war. His pilots were about to attempt something no Allied force had ever done before. They were escorting American bombers all the way to Berlin and bringing them home. It was a mission that had never succeeded just 3 days earlier. Many of those pilots had barely touched their new aircraft. Some had less than an hour of flight time in the P-51 Mustang. When they asked for more training, Blakesley's response became legend. "You'll learn to fly it on the way to the target." There was no time to wait. Every day, American bombers were being torn apart over Germany. Crews were dying faster than they could be replaced. Something had to change. And it had to change now. For 2 years, the skies over Germany had belonged to the Luftwaffe. Bomber crews had a name for the region beyond fighter escort range, the killing zone. And it earned that name in blood in August of 1943. American bombers struck deep into Germany, targeting critical factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The mission was meant to cripple the Nazi war machine. Instead, it nearly destroyed the 8th Air Force. Out of 376 bombers, 60 were shot down in a single day. Hundreds more limped home riddled with holes. 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured before nightfall. At that rate, the bomber force would be annihilated long before Germany ran out of planes or pilots. But abandoning the bombing campaign wasn't an option. Without it, Germany's factories would continue to churn out tanks, aircraft, and weapons. Any future invasion of Europe would face a fully armed enemy. The problem was simple and deadly. American fighters couldn't fly far enough. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, rugged, and heavily armed. Pilots loved it. They called it the Jug. It could absorb astonishing damage and still bring its pilot home. But it drank fuel at an unforgiving rate. Once the Thunderbolt reached the edge of its range, it had to turn back or fall out of the sky. German radar operators knew this. They watched the American formations carefully. The moment the escorts turned for home, German fighters pounced, striking the unprotected bombers with calculated precision. The timing was exact. The trap was deadly. And on that morning in March 1944, everything was about to change. Inside the B-17s, the radio crackled with final messages. Fighter pilots checked in one last time, clipped transmissions filled with static and strain. Then came the words every bomb war crew dreaded. Little friends heading home. One by one, the escorts peeled away, turning back toward safety. The radio fell silent, broken only by the steady roar of engines and the knowledge that the killing zone lay ahead. The men knew what came next. The German fighters arrived in waves. First came the heavy Interceptor twin-engine Messerschmitts, armed like flying gun platforms. They carried rockets, 30mm cannons, even air-to-air explosives designed to tear bombers apart from a distance. These were the Zerstörer, the destroyers. They stayed outside defensive gun range, launching their attacks from afar. A solid hit could rip a B-17 in half. Then came the second wave. Single-engine fighters, Bf-189s and Focke-Wulf 190s, fast, agile, and deadly. They sliced through the formations from every direction, raking the bombers with cannon fire. From the front, from below, from the sides. They attacked in coordinated patterns, overwhelming the defensive guns through sheer volume and precision. And they kept coming. On October 14, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt became one of the darkest days in American air warfare. 291 bombers launched that morning. 60 never returned. Another 138 staggered home, riddled with holes, many so badly damaged they would never fly again. In a single mission, nearly a quarter of the attacking force was lost. Each B-17 carried 10 men. That meant 600 airmen killed, wounded, or captured in just a few hours. Some survived being shot down, only to land in hostile territory, where not all captors were soldiers. For many, survival ended on the ground. The message was undeniable. The bomber offensive could not continue like this. Something had to change, or the air war would be lost before the invasion ever began. After the second Schweinfurt raid, deep strikes into Germany were halted. The losses were simply too great. The 8th Air Force could not survive at that rate. Crews who had signed on for 25 missions began doing the math. And what they saw terrified them. At a 10% loss rate per mission, the odds of finishing a tour were nearly zero. Statistically, survival was impossible. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, understood what that meant. Without a way to protect bombers all the way to their targets, and back, the entire strategic bombing campaign was doomed. Germany would keep producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons without interruption. Any future invasion of Europe would face a fully armed enemy. Something had to change. And unexpectedly, the answer would come from a British test pilot flying an American airplane with a British heart. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce engineer Ronald Harker evaluated a new fighter at the Royal Air Force's Testing Center at Duxford. The aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally, the Mustang had been designed in remarkable speed. Just 102 days from drawing board to first flight after, Britain asked North American Aviation to build P-40s under license. Instead, the company proposed something better. What they produced was fast, sleek, and remarkably efficient. Harker was impressed. At low altitude, the Mustang was faster than a Spitfire. It handled beautifully and possessed exceptional range, thanks to its advanced laminar flow wing and internal fuel capacity. But there was a fatal flaw. Above 15,000 feet, its performance collapsed. The Allison engine simply couldn't breathe in thin air. Its single-stage supercharger robbed the aircraft of power right where high-altitude combat took place. 4 escort missions at bomber altitude. The Mustang was crippled. But Harker saw what others had missed. The airframe was exceptional, arguably the best of the war. All it lacked was the right engine. He proposed a radical solution. Mate the Mustang's airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered Britain's best Spitfires. The Merlin's two-speed supercharger allowed it to maintain power at extreme altitudes, where other engines gasped for air. Combined with the Mustang's aerodynamics and long range, the result would be something entirely new, a fighter that could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything in the skies. Over Europe, a fighter capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and in doing so, changed the course of the air war forever. By late 1943, the Mustang had become something entirely new, a fighter born from British innovation, American industry, and wartime necessity. When the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England, few of its pilots had even seen the aircraft they were about to fly. They had trained on P-39, reshaped, underpowered machines never meant for the skies over Europe. Then they climbed into the Mustang. On December 1, 1943, the group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep, over occupied France. 2 weeks later, they were assigned something no American fighter unit had ever attempted. They would escort bombers all the way to Kiel, 480 miles into Germany. It was the deepest penetration ever attempted by single-engine fighters. This time, the Luftwaffe responded in force. But for the first time, the Americans did not turn back. The German pilots discovered something terrifying. These new American fighters could meet them at altitude, outclimb them, outturn them, and still stay. With the bombers to the target and beyond, the balance of power in the sky had shifted. The 354th Fighter Group became the first American unit to master long-range escort tactics, earning a Distinguished Unit Citation and producing the 8th Air Force's first Mustang Aces. But one pilot would soon prove just how far the Mustang could go. Major James Howard was unlike most fighter pilots in Europe. Born in China, to missionary parents, he had grown up in the Far East. He learned to fly before the war, joined the U.S. Navy, and later transferred to the Army Air Forces. By the time he arrived in England, he was already a veteran of combat analytical, and fearless. On January 11th, Howard led his squadron on a deep penetration escort mission into Germany. The target was the aircraft factories at Auschwitz Deep. In enemy territory, as the bombers approached the target, German fighters attacked in overwhelming numbers. Wave after wave of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts slammed into the formation. One by one, Howard's wingmen were forced to break away low on fuel, out of ammunition, or damaged. Soon, he was alone, one Mustang against more than 30 German fighters. And yet, he stayed. For over 30 minutes, Howard fought alone above the bombers, diving through enemy formations, breaking up attacks, forcing the Luftwaffe to scatter again and again. He fired until his guns ran dry. He maneuvered until his fuel gauges nearly hit zero. He refused to abandon the bombers. When he finally turned for home, the bombers were still intact. Howard landed with empty guns, near empty tanks, and a shattered canopy, but every bomber he had covered survived. For his actions that day, Major James Howard received the Medal of Honor. But his victory was larger than any single mission. The Mustang had proven itself. From that point forward, American bombers no longer flew alone. The Luftwaffe would never again control the skies over Germany, and the long road to victory in Europe had finally turned in the Allies' favor. Here is the ** continuation of the rewritten, fully original Narration, ***, matching the same cinematic tone, pacing, and historical accuracy. Clean, engaging, and ready for voiceover. Yet even as German factories struggled to replace lost aircraft, the greater problem was far more severe. They could not replace the men. Pilots were the Luftwaffe's most irreplaceable resource, and Big Week bled that resource dry. Veteran flyersmen with hundreds of hours of combat experience were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Training pipelines collapsed under pressure, turning out pilots with only a fraction of the experience their fallen predecessors had possessed. The balance of the air war had begun to tilt irreversibly. While German losses mounted, Allied strength grew at an astonishing rate. Each month, more Mustangs arrived in England. Improved models rolled off American production lines faster than they could be ferried across the Atlantic. Squadrons that once struggled to field enough aircraft were now flush with replacements, and the doctrine had changed. American fighters were no longer tethered to the bombers like defensive shields. Instead, they were unleashed. Mustang pilots were encouraged to hunt rumming ahead of the bomber stream, diving on airfields, catching German fighters as they took off or attempted to land. The sky over Germany became a killing ground. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer win. Its experienced pilots were gone. Fuel shortages, limited training flights. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with barely enough hours to land safely, let alone fight seasoned American aces, and above them, Mustangs prowled endlessly fast, high, and relentless. The final proof came during the lead-up to D-Day, as Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Europe. They needed air supremacy above Normandy. Not temporary control but absolute dominance. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. It threw everything it had left into the skies of Western Europe, and it failed. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops crossed the English Channel under a protective umbrella of air power. Unlike anything seen before, German aircraft appeared only in scattered, ineffective numbers. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies was broken. The Mustang had done what no Baker's aircraft before it could do. It had followed the bombers all the way to their targets. It had fought the enemy on equal terms and beaten them. And in doing so, it helped ensure that the invasion of Europe could succeed. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 P-51s had been built. They flew in every theater, escorted bombers to the heart of the enemy, and became symbols of air superiority. But their greatest legacy was this: they proved that air power, when properly protected, could decide the fate of nations. The skies over Europe were won not by chance, but by design, determination, and a fighter that arrived just in time. Here is a clean, fully rewritten narrative continuation of the section you provided, tightened, cinematic, and historically faithful, matching the tone and pacing of a professional documentary script. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a crisis it could no longer hide. Aircraft losses were severe, but the true catastrophe lay in the loss of men. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced, and the consequences were devastating. Entire Jagdgeschwader saw their veteran leaders disappear within weeks. Men who had survived years of combat aces with dozens of victories were falling to young American pilots barely out of training. With them went irreplaceable knowledge. Tactics learned through hard experience. Instincts sharpened over countless engagements. The Luftwaffe's training system collapsed under the strain. New pilots arrived at the front with only a handful of flight hours, sent into combat with little preparation and no mentors to guide them. Even worse, many of those lost were Commander's Group and Commander, and Staffel Capet, the very officers responsible for shaping tactics and holding formations together in combat. Without them, cohesion crumbled. Inexperienced pilots made fatal mistakes, and there was no one left to correct them. By early 1944, the German fighter arm was bleeding to death. When Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring reportedly saw American Mustangs escorting bombers over Berlin itself, he is said to have realized the truth. The war in the air was lost. Whether or not he spoke the words, the reality was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed over its own territory, one irreplaceable pilot at a time. The contrast with the Americans could not have been sharper. The 4th Fighter Group, known as the Debden Eagles, embodied the transformation. Formed from the American volunteers of the RAF Eagle squadrons, they had been fighting since before the United States officially entered the war. Now re-equipped with P-51 Mustangs, they were unleashed in a new kind of air war. At first, even these seasoned pilots were skeptical of the Mustang. It looked lighter, almost fragile compared to the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt. But doubts vanished the moment they flew it in combat. Under the leadership of Colonel Don Blakesley, The 4th Fighter Group became one of the most aggressive units in the 8th Air Force. Among its pilots were men who would become legends: Don Gentile and John Godfrey, foremost among them. Together, they pioneered new combat tactics built on speed, coordination, and initiative. Instead of rigid formations, they fought fluidly, watching each other's blind spots and striking from unexpected angles. Enemy pilots who thought they were attacking a lone fighter suddenly found themselves caught in a lethal crossfire. Their reputation spread quickly. German pilots reportedly referred to them as the Debden gangsters, and with good reason. Gentile, a first-generation American and former Eagle Squadron pilot, became one of the most celebrated aces of the war. Flying his Mustang Shangri-La, he racked up victory after victory. On March 8, 1944, he and Godfrey tore into a formation of enemy fighters, claiming multiple kills in a single engagement. By April, Gentile had surpassed Eddie Rickett's World War I record. His fame grew rapidly, so much so that it ultimately ended his combat career. After crashing his aircraft during a low pass at Debden Airfield, he was grounded and sent home to tours as a war hero. But the legend of the Mustang did not rest on one man. The 4th Fighter Group would go on to claim over 1,000 aerial victories, more than any other American fighter unit. Their success was echoed by other Mustang-equipped groups, including the 357th Fighter Group, home to pilots like Bud Anderson and Chuck Yeager. Anderson, flying his Mustang Old Crow, became one of the war's greatest aces without ever being hit by enemy fire. He survived 116 combat missions through skill, awareness, and discipline qualities the Mustang magnified. Even German aces took notice. Gunther Rahel, one of the highest-scoring pilots in history, later flew captured Mustangs and was stunned by their performance. The cockpit comfort, the reliability of the Merlin engine, and the aircraft's extraordinary range and endurance left a lasting impression. Compared to the cramped, temperamental German fighters, the Mustang was a revelation. By 1944, the equation of air warfare had changed forever. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was being hunted in its own skies. American fighters now dictated when and where combat would occur. The bomber streams were no longer vulnerable herds. They were protected by relentless escorts that could follow them anywhere. The P-51 Mustang did not win the war alone, but it made victory possible. Here is a *** clean, polished narrative continuation *** of the section you posted, rewritten for clarity, pacing, and documentary-style flow while preserving the historical detail and tone. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing under the weight of its own losses. German pilots knew the truth. The war in the air had turned decisively against them. The Mustang could remain aloft for 7 hours or more, sometimes nearly twice as long as its opponents. When German fighters were forced to disengage for fuel, American escorts remained overhead, waiting. Airfields were no longer sanctuaries. Fighters attempting to land were hunted down. Those preparing to take off were strafed on the ground. As one German ace later admitted, there was nowhere left to hide. Losses mounted at a catastrophic rate. By mid-1944, some Luftwaffe units were losing a quarter of their pilots every month. Training pipelines collapsed under the strain. Where German pilots once arrived at the front with hundreds of flight hours, new arrivals now had fewer than 100, sometimes barely enough to fly the aircraft safely, let alone fight in it. Many had never fired their guns in combat. Some had never practiced aerial gunnery at all. The result was a vicious cycle. Inexperienced pilots died quickly, leaving even fewer veterans to train replacements. The Luftwaffe's institutional knowledge built over years of combative almost overnight. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived in Europe with hundreds of hours of flight time, extensive gunnery training, and a growing mastery of air combat tactics. The difference in quality was as decisive as the difference in numbers. General Jimmy Doolittle understood this reality better than anyone. Early in 1944, he fundamentally changed American fighter doctrine. Until then, escorts were ordered to stay close to the bombers, forming a protective shield. Doolittle tore down that doctrine. When he saw a sign at 8th Air Force headquarters reading **, the first duty of the fighter is to protect the bombers, **, he ordered it replaced. The new message read simply, **, the first duty of the fighter is to destroy the German Air Force. **. From that moment on, American fighters went on the offensive. Mustangs ranged far ahead of bomber streams, hunting German aircraft wherever they could be found, on climb-out, on landing approach, even on the ground. Airfields were strafed, fuel depots were destroyed, pilots were killed before they ever reached altitude. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Of the thousands of aircraft theoretically available, only a few hundred were operational. On D-Day itself, the Allies flew more than 5,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed barely 300. The skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. For the soldiers landing on the beaches, the absence of German aircraft was unmistakable. Where once Stukas had ruled the skies, now Allied fighters roamed unchallenged. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1940 was effectively gone. The Mustang had made that possible. Its combination of range, speed, reliability, and firepower allowed it to do what no previous fighter could: escort bombers all the way to their targets and back again, while destroying the enemy's ability to respond. It didn't just win dogfight. It erased the Luftwaffe as a functional fighting force, thought by war's end. The Mustang had become one of the most successful fighter aircraft in history. More than 15,000 were built. Over 4,900 enemy aircraft were destroyed in air-to-air combat. It served in every major theater and remained in frontline service long after the war ended. But its greatest legacy lay not in statistics, but in consequence. The Mustang made daylight strategic bombing possible. It shattered German air power. It helped ensure Allied dominance of the skies over Europe, and in doing so, it shortened the war itself. Long after the guns fell silent, the men who flew the Mustang carried its legacy with them into the jet age, into peacetime service, and into history. From Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, to Bud Anderson's lifelong advocacy for aviation, to former enemies becoming friends. The Mustang's story endured far beyond the war that forged it. It was more than an airplane. It was the aircraft that won the air war. Here is a ***, cleaned, tightened, professionally narrated version ***, of your final section, preserving every historical point while improving flow, pacing, and emotional impact for documentary voice. Nothing has been added or removed, only refined for clarity and rhythm. After the war ended, restored Mustangs began appearing at air shows around the world. The distinctive growl of the Merlin engine became instantly recognized, sound that still stirs something deep in those who hear it. These aircraft are living reminders of a time when piston engines ruled the sky, when young men fought alone at 30,000 feet, when victory and death were separated by seconds. Yet, the Mustang's true legacy goes far beyond the aircraft itself. It represented the convergence of insight and innovation, British vision, recognizing American potential, American industry delivering unmatched production, and tactical evolution, reshaping how wars were fought. It was proof that air superiority was not won by chance, but by engineering, training, and relentless determination. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring later acknowledged this reality. He admitted that the failure of the Luftwaffe was sealed. The Maine's allies fielded a long-range escort fighter capable of reaching deep into Germany. Without it, he said, the air war could not have been lost. The P-51 did not win the war by itself. No single machine ever could. But it solved a problem that had once seemed impossible. Oh how? To protect bombers all the way to their targets and back again? It allowed Allied air power to reach anywhere in Europe. It broke the Luftwaffe's strength. It made victory in the skies, and ultimately on the ground, possible. The men who flew the Mustang earned their place in history. The engineers who designed it created one of the finest aircraft ever built. The workers who produced it armed an entire generation. Together, they turned an idea into a weapon that changed the course of the war. The Mustang was not just a machine, it was a promise that skill, innovation, and courage could overcome even the greatest odds. And that promise still echoes today. Every time a Merlin engine roars back to life in the sky,